Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sire here today to discuss with you the closing part of our topic here on the Western Front, which is now a concern with the donkey thesis and an exploration into if it was a myth or actually was a reality. It's important to stress this is for the student level, and this one especially because we're going to consider all the campaigns we've studied across this series. As always, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. Now, a big weakness students tend to make in their essays is they kind of just say what they know. They a big ream, a big stream of consciousness, and go, right, this was 1914, 15, 16, 17, all the way through the war. And they just tell that knowledge and rim it off. And that's great. It's good to show your knowledge. The big foundation you need as historians is actually contextual knowledge to use and put to use. However, you need to actually organize it in a very structured, thematic way. And one way we can do that is by establishing criteria. This is something, especially for your longer essays, you can put in the introduction and make sure you link back to as you go throughout your essay. So, what criteria can we use for the First World War? What have we discovered as we've gone through all our initial background context and our overview videos, and of course, all our in depth knowledge for each of the specific battles and campaigns? Well, I've got a suggestion here for you on the screen. This is one potential way you can do it. There are others, but it's important to take this into account. Do remember the question you could get for your own examinations can vary, so do, of course, tailor it to the question that you get. The one I'm giving you here today is generally about all the British leadership as a whole. You may get ones more specific for certain leaders or certain campaigns, or maybe they'll include politicians as well. So it's important you consider that and adapt what I'm telling you today for each question you get. Always check with your own history teachers as well. They may do things slightly differently for your own exam board that you're with, your own specification. So do, of course, clarify first, is this the right way to do it? Is there another way? That's the beauty of history. There are other ways to tackle the essay, especially if you want to come to a different judgment than what we may come to today and in future videos. So I'll walk through you now what these criteria actually are. For one type of question, it could be a change over time question. And so we've encountered this a little bit before in some previous videos, but I want to remind us what that is. Essentially, it's assessing how things have improved or declined or stayed the same. And again, depending on your time frame, you could be asked to look at a single battle or campaign, or for the sake of this video, the entirety of the war from start to finish. And that's what my knowledge will cater for, and that's what we'll go through. Other more specific factor criteria are the four following. We have technology, for instance, our artillery and tanks, our tactics, or line formation, skirmishing, creeping barrage, defense in depth, combined arms, casualties, how many people were killed, how many were wounded, did this number go up or down, what caused that, what didn't cause it, these kind of things. And the final one, which is the alliances. How did the British forces work, not just within their own units, but also with other forces that come in, such as the Americans, the French, and of course their own Dominion allies throughout the war. And of course, we can use any key battle that we have studied. We have especially looked at the Somme, Passchendaele, and Amiens battles and their offensives. But this is why throughout the series, I've been saying you could expand your knowledge further and take some of that wider reading forward. This really does reward those of you who have gone away and taken that knowledge in and really expanded upon it. As I say, we looked at those three battles, the Somme, Passchendaele, and Amiens, but I've mentioned many more. I've mentioned Mons, I've mentioned Marne, I've mentioned Aubers Ridge, I've mentioned Loos, I mentioned Messines Ridge as well, I mentioned the Battle of Arras, I mentioned other offensives like the Battle of Hamel. So there's a whole variety of campaigns that you can make use of here to really put your Western Front knowledge to the test. So whatever I'm going to say to you now, that's going to be specialized for the three campaigns that we've looked at in detail together. But again, you can expand this further with your own notes, with your own plans going forward to include those campaigns that you've referenced. Perhaps as I make some comments, if I think, oh wait, yeah, that also happened at Aubers Ridge. Oh wait, yeah, Amel showed some sign of that. So make those connections for yourself as we go forward, and really, as I say, expand your essays and expand your knowledge as historians. So, I'll give you some detail now of what we can exactly expand onto. I'll walk you through potential structure for how you can do it. But again, do remember this is tailored for the question that I've given today. The contextual knowledge is universal for us to apply, but the questions you get will be slightly different. So do read carefully. Make sure you answer the question at all times. So Let us look at the first criteria, which is assessing technology. First off, we can split this into two of the major ones that I've considered with you throughout this course. The first one we looked at was tanks. First off, tanks were used quite successfully at the Somme, but it's important to distinguish how they were successful. So, for instance, at the Somme, as we remember, they did break down a bit, but they were psychologically effective. They were fearsome metal monsters. The Germans really were scared of them and didn't really have a response to stop them when they did reach places like Tirval in September and October. So there was some good successes there. But later in the war, once we get into 1917 and especially 1918, they become a real facet for what can be considered a successful unit in the war. They showed brilliant promise at Cambrai. Had there been infantry's reserve support to provide for them, they would have really made a great breakthrough of ground there. And also, especially at Amiens into the 100-day offensive, they were a key part of combined arms working and really replaced the cavalry as the go-to unit for driving success in combat. Another key part of technology was artillery. We saw how they evolved from 1916 onwards. Yes, they were initially a bit mixed in their success, but once things like creeping barrage were successful, and the idea of the reliance of infantry to always attack with them, to work together as a unit, was incredibly effective to destroy those positions so they could occupy them with ease later. However, there are some clear failures and limitations. As we say, the tanks, it's worth noting they did indeed break down at the Somme. Despite their successes when they were good, they were prone to that. And they also were not very good at Passchendaele. When, of course, the mud set in, they would slow down, they would be open to counterattacks. They weren't very good. So it's really selective in the war when tanks are quite useful. It's also worth noting as well, if we get a question where we assess the entirety of the war, tanks were not present in 1914, 15, and most of 1916. They're a later development in the war, so they're not really a technological success until a later point in the war. So if we use criteria to assess over time, they're not really a big success, are they? When we figure in the grand picture. It's also worth noting with artillery, it also had many failures. As we said, in 1915 and 16, they were prone to failures. Many of the rounds were initially duds. They struggled to batter the German positions, couldn't really destroy their pillboxes and damage their bunkers. It actually backfired for them in places like Aubers Ridge and Loos, when despite their effort to support, it became a false sense of security and allowed the Germans to launch brilliant counterattacks, incredible machine gun defenses, and sadly led to the churning and deaths of many soldiers. So we can't forget that sad reality there. That again, these are selective weapons that it really depends how they were used and when they were used for demonstrating their clear success in the campaign and the war as a whole. But of course, other things that you can remember from our studies that you could add in here as well, and also things you may have found out about later when you went away and did some further reading. Again, feel free to add these in yourself as well. Another criteria we can use is tactics. So, what evidence of success did we find with these? Well, the idea of the army evolving as the war went on. We saw that trench raids and the use of skirmishing became quite popular towards the later end of 1916 and beyond. The soldiers proved quite successful, and their raids and their tactics, their ability to move, fire and move, use wave and flow, of course, developed and improved later on in the war. We also saw infantry could be used in combination with other technologies, especially the artillery, to form successful creeping barrages, the artillery bombing a trench position, and the infantry able to come in and occupy it as then the artillery pushed on later on. And of course, the clockwork idea behind that, and especially by the end of the war, the use of combined arms using our infantry, tanks, artillery, and planes all together to form a successful offensive across the entire front and really restore that war of movement that had been lost during the war of attrition. But is there some failure? Well, sadly, there was. A lot of this is quite slow to come about. It's only really by 1918 that the weapons of offense came together and tactically they really improved. For much of the early points of the war, the defenses were winning. The Germans had a lot easier time holding their position despite the British offensives hitting into them. We also saw that line formations were quite blundered, many deaths happening at the likes of Aubers Ridge, Lewes, and especially those early days at the Somme in 1916. We also have repetition of failures as well. Again, this fixation by Haig on a breakthrough throughout most of the war, leading to those repeated mistakes at Passchendaele in 1917. So this is it's not a one done thing. we have errors leaking in throughout the timeline as well, as the war of attrition really becomes too difficult. We also can't forget the German tactics as well. As we said, they're relying on those defensive maneuvers, especially that defense in depth tactic with the retreat of Hindenburg Line in 1917. So again, you can find a way to look into the German tactics here as well, and how they maybe played a role in weakening the British and making their times a lot more difficult and less successful. Third criteria we can look into is assessing our alliances. Some clear successes are the essential teamwork that's happening across the various forces. The real alliance to highlight is the British and French. Throughout, they are really the allies throughout the whole war who are most consistent and with each other side by side. Again, despite initial plannings for the Somme, in the end that was an Anglo-French victory, and it did relieve the French positions at Verdun and really damaged the German offensive at the same time. Remember that led to the sacking of Falkenhayn and his replacement. So a lot of praise has to go for their teamwork there, especially the French being there on the Somme to assist them and allowing the British to lead that offensive later on. But we also have our Dominion forces as well. Again, the Canadians, the Australians, and of course the British Raj. We can't forget these troops. You may have done some further studies about them, and I really hope you have. Because again, although we say British, we mean the wider empire as well. We can't forget the likes of Arthur Currie and John Monash and all the soldiers who served under them, to of course enable many successes, especially the likes of Passchendaele. Again, Vimy Ridge was taken by the Canadians as well. So again, there's some big successes there. And as I said, John Monash with the Battle of Hamel, perfecting that combined arms offensive. There's a lot of admiration to be given for those Dominion troops, and we can't forget about them. Also, while the Americans, they joined the war late, yes, but they were there. They provided incredible supply, financial and military aid, and of course, fought some incredible offensives later on. As I say, we mentioned Belleau Wood in 1918. You may have gone away and studied some other ones as well. So do, of course, consider Pershing's doughboys and how us working with them could be a key idea of success as well. But there are some evidence of failures we have to note. Again, sadly, the French did fall into mutinies, especially after the defeats at Nivelle in 1917. And the Americans, they only really were a fighting force on the front by 1918. So there is some limitations to their support, and we can't forget about that. Same for the Empire troops as well. That initial 1914 offensive was only really the British Expeditionary Force, so we can't forget about that. But again, it's the timing of this. When were these troops actually here supporting? Again, we don't have these massive alliances on the table in use until the back end of the war. So if you're looking at the early assessment in your timeline, again, do consider that as a weak point for this alliance system as well. You notice as well, I've also not mentioned Russia, and this is fair game because Russia is not on the Western Front. But some questions will enable you to mention that Eastern Front and how, in the end, Russia did fall to revolution. And by that happening, that allowed the Germans to move their Eastern Front troops, put them on the Western Front. So, again, there are ways around that as well. And you just got to be careful, got to be cautious of what your question is. So, make sure you remember that. And the final criteria or theme we can assess is casualties. Now, casualties is a rough one. Evidence of success. This is a tough one to defend. Well, some ways historians do try and do this is pointing to difference in numbers. Many historians will, of course, point to 1918 as clear proof when casualties were finally dropping down compared to those mass losses that occurred in previous campaigns, and especially they'll compare them with the German losses as well. And when you look at Britons just on their own, they, of course, did suffer less losses overall than the German forces. And again, we have got some offensives where the British were very successful, the likes of Arras in 1917 and Hamel in 1918, were clear signs where the German casualties far exceeded the British, and lots of success was gained with relatively minimal losses. But this is a really difficult one to defend, and you'll probably find of your themes, this is the one where there's the most ammunition, pun intended, for there to be evidence of failure. So, of course, obvious ones are the Mons in 1914, Aubers Ridge and Loos in 1915. We see the BAF relentlessly sent to their deaths in those campaigns. Again, the carnage that's evident in there, the writings of Basil Liddell Hart and other ones that come down later on. As I say, Alan Clark's The Donkeys make lots of reference to this. Again, these senseless offensives where the men sadly die, they have these mass retreats, chaotic use of artillery and infantry combination that all ultimately fail and led to the deaths of many of the BEF. Many of them did survive, of course, and several of them would go on to fight in the rest of the war. But the devastation of the BEF, the professional fighting force of the British Army, cannot be overlooked in these campaigns. We also can't overlook some key turning points of proof, but particularly in 1916 at the Somme, again that first day on July the 1st, 22,000 casualties thereabouts that they suffered in the campaign. And again, some reports have it even higher. Some include the missing list, some include the wounded. So you get up to figures of like 57,000, maybe even 60,000. So, and that's just a single day of combat. That's a lot to lose in the sake of one day of combat. And again, those campaigns as a whole, the Somme at Wide and Passchendaele, millions overall were dying for just a few batches of land. Millions were dying for a few miles of land. And can these losses ever truly be considered acceptable? Is that really right to say? Yes, we can point to 1918 as this great chance of victory when it all came together, but the attritional war had caused those millions of deaths to come before. Is that really acceptable? Again, I'll let you answer that, but many historians certainly don't think it was. And so that's our criteria. They are our themes that we have assessed and had a look at. Again, when you're writing essay responses of this, or maybe even a thesis essay if you're at the university level, or maybe A level coursework, again, do consider each of these criteria as you go through it. Make a judgment on each one. You can do this in the concluding part of every paragraph for each of the themes, or save it for your big judgment at the end. Again, check with your own history teachers or lecturers just to be sure which style they're expecting you to do. But some closing criteria questions you need to consider when you make this judgment are always try and make a decision which factor, which theme did you consider the best for proving success in the whole war? Was it the changes? Was it technology? Was it tactics? Was it the reduced casualties later on? Was it the alliances? That's what you have to decide. And of course, conversely, which one revealed the most blunders, the most mistakes? Which one do some historians have proof to say that indeed the generals were donkeys and were essentially sending the lions of their men to their deaths? And that's a big question to really finish this off. Again, this is a general one for the whole of the British leadership across the war. So again, you can pick out some key cases. We'll also be doing one final video to close this, where we'll do a feature on Douglas Haig. Again, he was a man who many considered had won the war. Some believed he was a fool who sent men to their deaths quite needlessly. We'll explore him in greater detail, but that's where we'll leave it for today. Again, thank you as always for watching. I hope you found this quite insightful, quite useful, especially those of you who are students for the A level and maybe university level, considering this as one of your options. I look forward to see you in my class again for our final video to conclude this series, where we'll look at Douglas Haig in more detail as an isolated case. I will, of course, be leaving, as always, my further reading in the description box below. So, of course, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, and maybe check out some of that wider reading as well to improve your detail and depth of knowledge as historians. As we say, there's always more to learn, and it's certainly up to you to go away and do that. So, thank you for watching. This is History with Sire. Thank you for listening.